Now, as a few of you may know, I have a bit of a history on here when it comes to Japanese wrestling. I absolutely love it after all. It's a passion as big as gaming or music or anything else, especially the good old days of the 1990s. It is a passion that's even got me into some trouble. Being a big fan of the old Puro, I've naturally tried to recreate it in many of the wrestling games I've played over the years. Everything from making edits of my favourites, folks like Kawada, Misawa and Jushin Liger in my favourite WWE games, to playing games from Japan itself. Who cares if I don't speak the language? Most of the time it doesn't matter and I have loads of fun anyway. There's one particular series, Spike's Fire Pro Wrestling, that I've spent, well, thousands of hours with. I've done videos on it and everything. It's the greatest wrestling game series ever. But today, I thought I'd do something different. Fire Pro isn't the only Japanese wrestling series out there. There's plenty more. And there's some pretty damn good ones as well as others that perhaps are a bit more weird. So that's what we're doing today. We're looking at a bunch of Puroresu games that aren't Fire Pro. Also, be sure to watch this vid to the finish, because I have a very special and awesome announcement about the future when it comes to my wrestling documentaries. But before that, let's go. I thought I would take this chronologically, and what better place to start than the platform where Fire Pro actually began? There wouldn't be a Fire Pro if it wasn't for the good old PC Engine, or TurboGrafx 16 if you're American. The late great Human Entertainment set the ball rolling in 1989, and those consequences haven't been the same since. So I wondered if there was a Japanese-only Fire Pro alternative even at this quite early stage. In the end I didn't find one, although I did find two weird games that are examples of, well, a very Japanese style of game, I suppose. Hell, I'm almost including them out of curiosity, and to see if anyone in the comments can see the appeal of such things. Here then is Maniac Pro Wrestling Asu no Tatakai from Hudson Soft. It appears that in this game you play as someone who's in training to become a wrestler. The game tells their story. There's a lot of cutscenes and a lot of text, meaning that this is quite the adventure. The actual wrestling itself though, that's something I don't really get. You move around each other, and then when you clash you just select a move. A big flashy animation plays out, all very anime and so on, and then the whole process just sort of repeats. There's not exactly much struggle. It never seemed like I could reverse moves or anything, or that there was much risk involved in just picking whatever move I wanted. Kind of odd. Perhaps I would find a harder challenge if I'd played further, but, well, all this flash and pizzazz just seems to hide a game that's basically just bloody menu selection. There's another game kinda similar to this on the system, Monster Pro Wrestling. As you might expect, this game doesn't actually feature actual wrestlers. It features big old monsters. However, that doesn't mean we get some arcadey King of the Monsters style action. Instead, again, we get to choose from a bunch of moves. There is a slight element of risk this time. You get a dice roll, and most of the time whoever has the higher number pulls off the move. But that's it. Again, there's tons of very impressive looking cutscenes for just about every move, but in the end, it's a dice roll. There seems to be a lot of these sorts of games around that never made it out of Japan, more than just wrestling ones. I'd hesitate to say that they're bad games as such, they're just games I don't get. What was the appeal of them? Is it the adventure and the storytelling? Is it the training aspect and the other things outside of the in-ring action? I'm not sure. I leave it to the comments to hopefully elucidate, or at least call me a twat. In the meantime, here's a bit more action. We go to the Sega Mega Drive for a wrestling game that's entirely populated by Joshi wrestlers, meaning women of course. For those who don't know, Joshi Pro-Res has at various times been massively popular, with ludicrously talented wrestlers to boot, as good as anyone you care to name. And so there are a couple of games that are totally based around Joshi. Like this one, Cutie Suzuki no Inside Angel, a game by Asmic from 1990. Cutie Suzuki was at the time a very popular wrestler in the JWP promotion who also did a bit of crossover into music and films, and while she wasn't ever exactly the greatest of wrestlers, it makes sense for her to get a game given her popularity. Indeed, Cutie Suzuki is the sole real star of this game. The other wrestlers are fictional, although, as is often the case, they're based off real-life stars. You can perhaps pick out folks based on the likes of Dump Matsumoto, Devil Masami or the Crush Girls if you've watched your fair share of Joshi. The main mode here has you take a wrestler through various knockout cups and tournaments, all the way through to the Grand Championship, so long as you've got the time and inclination to get that far anyways. And will you? Well, it's a so-so game. The main difference you tend to find between Japanese and Western wrestling games is that grapples are usually decided through timing as opposed to button mashing, although this is sort of in the middle on that front. Honestly, mashing seems to be the best approach a lot of the time. In any case, you can pretty much spam strikes and submissions on your opponents, which sap tons of energy and can make the game kind of easy. The graphics are fine, as is the general presentation, including a commentary team that often consists of either Asmik's dinosaur mascot or the frickin' Terminator, and there's nice animations and so forth, but playing it does kinda get old quickly. Alas, there's just not a whole lot out there for Japanese wrestling on the Mega Drive. The coolest thing about this game, in fact, is the cover. Look at it! It's lenticular! Cutie Suzuki changes her pose depending on the light. How cool is that? Well, not very cool, I suppose. Still, there's not many lenticular Mega Drive covers out there, so that's a bit unique. In the 16-bit era, when it came to Japanese wrestling games, the SNES ruled the roost without question. Obviously it was where Fire Pro made its home, but there were plenty of other games besides that, including some really good ones. Hence why 4 of the 10 games here are off the SNES, and only one of them is crap. Let's get that one out of the way first. Tenryu Genichiro no Pro Wrestling Revolution by Jaleco. It's a game based around the independent War promotion, which stands for Wrestle and Romance by the way, and indeed it's named after the promotion's founder and main star, the legendary Genichiro Tenryu. Tenryu is one of my absolute favourite wrestlers, so naturally I had high hopes for a game based around him. Alas, these hopes were dashed immediately. This is sort of like those strange PC Engine games we saw earlier, only the action is a bit more involved. There are actual strikes and moves you can do in the traditional way, as well as a timing-based grapple system, but there's also big fancy cutscenes on the top and bottom for each wrestler. So it's a hybrid, in other words. And it really doesn't work. It doesn't matter how good the cutscenes are because the in-ring action is so bloody small. And all they really do is distract from playing the friggin' thing, which in any case is so slow and unresponsive. This game, quite simply, does not work. The idea should have been cast into the bin at birth, but it wasn't, and here's the lousy result. Amazingly, it's the only game of these 10 that actually saw Western shores. It got a release internationally as Hammerlock Wrestling. The game does actually have a few fans here and there, but I have to be honest and say that I just don't see it. Jaleco thankfully fared a lot better with another title, and it's the return of Joshi Puroresu. We have more than just Cutie Suzuki this time. In fact, it's not just her, it's her home promotion. Presenting JWP Joshi Pro Wrestling Puroresu Queens. Join Cutie Suzuki along with a collection of JWP's top stars. Dynamite Kansai, Mayumi Ozaki, Kandi Yokotsu, Hikari Fukuoka. If you were watching back in the day, these gals walled. You can enter big old tournaments featuring all these folks, along with the regular options of single, tag and all of that. You generally find Japanese wrestling games to be a bit thinner on the ground than American ones in this department, particularly in the 90s, and unless it was a deathmatch promotion, most companies didn't run many gimmick matches involving ladders or tables or whatever. Still, the action makes up for it. Puroresu Queens is a decent game all told. Thankfully, the silly cutscenes of the last game are gone in favour of a properly sized display. You can actually see what's going on, which I think we can all agree is a massive improvement. The grappling is a lot better throughout. It's easier to pick out when you should actually press the button on a lockup in order to time the button press, and the system also allows for plenty of reversals. If you look closely, you can see wrestlers flash whenever they can reverse, and you can get a pretty good chain going. These wrestlers all look really bloody good too. Properly proportioned and detailed, they're as good a 16-bit recreation of an actual wrestler as you'll find. This definitely redeems Jaleco after the previous fiasco, and it's worth checking out for sure. A shame that this didn't make it to Western shores while bloody Hammerlock Wrestling did for some reason. All of this said, it's no surprise to find out that a lot of other Japanese wrestling games were, well, heavily influenced by Fire Pro. It was quite a popular series after all, loved for the simple system and of course the huge roster that gave a pretty good overview of world wrestling at the time. Why bother with just 12 or so wrestlers when you can have 100 or more? Others wanted a piece of that pie too, and so they'd make games that were pretty definitely inspired by Human's classic. But that doesn't mean they're no good. Indeed, the two we've got here are crackers. The first one, Jikyo Power Pro Wrestling 96 Max Voltage, is an attempt by Konami to get a bit of that Fire Pro magic going. You may notice quickly that this certainly looks a lot different to what we've seen so far. I mean, all the sprites are rotoscoped. You don't get many other games that look like this, certainly on the SNES, all the go-ward shading and that. It's not too surprising perhaps, seeing as this is a pretty late title and folks like Konami might want to flex their muscles a little bit. I have to say though that I do prefer more simple sprites to what we have here. Even though their movement is really fluid, that's no substitute for war speed. That said, there's a lot to enjoy here. We've got commentary throughout for one thing, and a cool roster. While there's not quite as many wrestlers as Fire Pro, a whole division of the roster is made up entirely of classic Konami characters, interpreted in wrestler form. You've got Bill and Lance from Contra, you've got Richter Belmont, there's even an attempt at wrestlifying a Vic Viper from Gradius. There aren't exactly many other wrestling games that try to do something like this. In fact, I can't think of any whatsoever. This inspired touch alone makes Power Pro Wrestling at the very least certainly worth having a curious look at. Still, of all the attempts to try and outdo Fire Pro at its own game, there is one that for my money comes really close. It's not quite up to the level of a Super Fire Pro Wrestling X Premium, but it could happily fit in. Here's Gekitou Burnin' Pro Wrestling, a game by Bulletproof Software. That is indeed the same studio that was won by Henk Rogers and played a big part in the wranglings for Tetris. But here's another reason to know them. As you could probably surmise purely from the game's name, this is as close a clone to Fire Pro as you're going to get. You've got a whole load of wrestlers with the names changed around a bit, but all pretty recognisable to anyone who follows Puroresu. You've got guys from the big leagues, New Japan and All Japan, guys from independent promotions such as FMW and Michinoku Pro, a division that's basically a WWF WCW hybrid, as well as fighters from early MMA shoot wrestling promotions like Pancrase, UWFI and Rins. The action plays exactly like Fire Pro. You have weak, medium and strong strikes and grapples, and your best bet is to start with the weak moves and just work your way up. You initiate a grapple by bumping into each other, time your button press for just after a particular and very noticeable frame of animation, and hopefully you do your move. This system, in its own way, tends to produce something that, even if it is played competitively, reproduces the structure and flow of an actual pro wrestling match. It's so very Fire Pro. The only major difference in look, quite frankly, is that the ring has been rotated 45 degrees from where it usually is in Humans games. And yet, damn it if it doesn't play superbly. The animations are almost as good and as satisfying as the best of SNES Fire Pro, which is actually saying a hell of a lot. The speed is most certainly there, fast and intense, but not giving up that proper match structure. There's some different modes to play with when it comes to doing a bit more than just having exhibition bouts, and coolest of all, you can, if you want, choose to play as the referee. It's not like Special Referee in SmackDown where you can happily play as Steve Austin and just dish out stunners to everyone on a whim. You are limited to purely reffing actions like counting falls, asking wrestlers if they give up, or holding the illegal man back. And if you do that for too long, well, you'll get laid out with a punch. This is a fun little gimmick indeed. It certainly adds a different dimension to what I usually do in a Fire Pro game, which is just sit back and let the CPU do its thing. Overall, this is fantastic. As derivative of Fire Pro as the game might be, it does an excellent job of trying to take on the kin. Highly recommended. Now, what about the 32-bit systems? Specifically the PlayStation and Nintendo 64? Now, as we all know, back in the 90s, the discerning PS1 user could mostly lord it over those poor Nintendo 64 folk. Look at all of these RPGs, listen to that crisp and clear audio, check out this massive library of gems. Mighty Aki WWF and WCW games, and the PS1 did not. It had WWF Warzone and Attitude. The later arrival of SmackDown was the only thing that slightly redressed the balance, but even then, yes, still N64. With this in mind, let's ask the question, does this massive gap in quality carry over to Japan? Well, the PS1 did have Fire Pro G, of course, just as the Saturn had 6-Man Scramble and the Dreamcast had Fire Pro D. All of this generation's platforms had a Fire Pro game except the N64. But as those are out of the question, let's go for this instead. Shin Nihon Pro Wrestling, Toukon Retsuden 3, developed by a name that will be quite familiar. Good old Yuke's, later of SmackDown fame. As the name suggests, this game is entirely based around New Japan pro wrestling folk, with a full roster of stars: Chono, Muta, Liger, Hashimoto, and of course, Inoki. You can't not have the big chin. Toukon Retsuden is a fair bit different and a little more considered than Yuke's later WWF game. If you've played Power Move Pro Wrestling on PS1, you've played a westernised version of the first instalment, and this third one is much the same but certainly cleaned up a fair bit. I always enjoyed Power Move, as early a game as that was. In the main, it just felt really nice to play with, very satisfying moves, and this does too. It's certainly nice to play a version of this game where you don't have to play as, I don't know, Kinog, or the Commandant, or any other rather stupidly named wrestler. It's not a massive leap from the original game that I'm more familiar with, of course. In the main, it's just considerably nicer in the presentation department. The sort of thing that you would like to see evolve further through the generations. Now, for the most part, this wouldn't happen, as Yuke's got the big WWF contract, and SmackDown was quite a bit different from this. There is a fourth Toukon Retsuden game that's Dreamcast only, which is actually quite a bit more like SmackDown. You can almost think of that as the bridge between the two series. And hey, the Dreamcast is also where you can play the pretty good Sega arcade conversion that is Giantgram 2000. And when you look at what's on the N64, you understand that absolutely none of this even matters one frickin' iota. This video, considering its subject matter, has to feature at least one all-time classic of a game, even if it's one that's pretty well known. As any wrestling fan with an N64 knows, the Aki games are kin. Mainly WCW NWO Revenge, Wrestlemania 2000, and of course, WWF No Mercy. I would say that as far as actually playing a wrestling game goes, they are the best by a long way. Speaking as someone who generally just sims on Fire Pro, although that is my favourite, if I had to pick just one game to actually play, it's Aki, every time. And Aki's brilliant work reached its peak on the N64 for Japanese audiences. The best of an all-time great series. I am, of course, talking about Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 Udo Keishu. As big a Fire Pro fan as I am, if someone was to say that this was the greatest wrestling game ever made, I'd find it kind of tricky to actually disagree with them. So what makes VPW2? You get a great roster, of course, one that captures a certain time. It's an All Japan licensed game from 2000, one that came out mere months before the big split. So what you have here roster-wise is kinda like the end of an era. Misawa, Kobashi, Vader, Taue, Akiyama. Not long after this game, none of these guys would be part of All Japan anymore. It's awesome on that front, even without also having unofficial representations of not just big stars from other companies and legends, but also MMA fighters. One of the big differences between this and the Aki WWF games is the MMA fighting mode, something that was totally excised from games like No Mercy. Sometimes the MMA mode in games like this can feel a bit tacked on, but the one in VPW2 is actually quite in-depth, and certainly no slouch. Hell, this was one of the best MMA games around for a long time, at least until studios actually got serious about the sport. Still, it says wrestling on the marquee, and that's what you come to this game for. And this has the best wrestling action. If you've played something like No Mercy already, you kinda know how good it is. the utterly satisfying, lovingly crafted animation, the momentum system and how matches just ebb and flow, all packed in with controls that are very simple indeed to just pick up and play. Even if you barely play games at all, you could be having fun with these games in minutes. But here, where the classic Aki gameplay tries to emulate the Kins Road All Japan style, geez, it's just even better somehow. It's not just no mercy with a Puro reskin. There's very noticeable differences in how the games play. There's a bigger focus on strikes, particularly with the introduction of lengthy combinations. Generally speaking, matches here take a longer time to finish than they would in No Mercy, just as they would in Kins Road matches. There's even the emulation of fighting spirit, moments where you hit a big move like say a head drop suplex, but then all of a sudden your opponent gets back up and does the same to you with his last gasp of energy. Things like that just never get old. I mean, this game as a whole will never age. Even if it's been a couple of years since I last played it, I can always just fall back into it so easily. It takes no time at all for me to stick two legends in the ring, get involved in an epic struggle that I never once had to try and artificially engineer, and fall in love all over again. What a freaking game this is. And lastly, we're going to the PlayStation 2 for our final duo. It feels appropriate to end here, on the platform where I got my first proper introduction to Fire Pro. Fire Pro Returns, a game that happily took a large chunk of my life. That and, well, the PS2 is the last platform where we saw any particularly decent number of Puro games, as the mid-late 2000s general decline of wrestling in Japan meant that there's barely been any wrestling games at all since then. But on the PS2, the Puro fan wasn't just limited to mucking about with 2D sprites in Fire Pro for a good game. Hell, if you wanted a very Fire Pro-esque experience, only with 3D, you could always have a go at Spike's excellent King of Colosseum 2. But I'm not going to cover that today. Instead, let's start off with, of all things, a wrestling game by Square Enix. Not necessarily a company you would associate with wrestling, eh? But here we are, and here's All-Star Pro Wrestling 3 from 2003. Square's All-Star Pro Wrestling series had started out pretty bare bones and, on the whole, not very good. It's quite surprising that it took until this third and indeed final instalment for the game to actually include an edit mode, for example. But now, well, we've got a fair few modes. And plenty of wrestlers too. As we go into the PS2 era, it's now common for games to get licenses from multiple promotions, as opposed to sticking with just one, meaning that ASPW3 features real wrestlers from New Japan, Pro Wrestling Noah, and 01, along with a bunch of freelancers. ASPW3 fixes a bunch of problems the previous games had, and then some, and the end result is actually pretty spectacular. No one talks about this game too much nowadays, but they really should. First off, it's amazing looks-wise for PS2. Probably the best looking wrestling game up to that point, and certainly the best looking Japanese one. The entrances, for example, are freaking epic, especially in the Tokyo Dome, and the action and the models there, pretty good too. The play is simple enough. Generally it should be familiar to most in that you have to play the game like you're working a proper match, starting with weaker moves and gradually building up to stronger ones, but there's other things to pay attention to. The rush meter, for example, which fills up as you get beaten on and allows you to make a really strong comeback. But where this game really shines is in all the little details. It feels like a labour of love that seemingly tries to emulate all the best things about Puro, all of its little quirks, from the big stand and the strike exchanges, to the all-time great moments, in quite unique ways. For example, it's possible, as seen in the intro, to do Misawa's terrifying tiger suplex off the ramp to Kenta Kobashi, one of the most famous moments in any pro wrestling match. But it's not something you just set for any wrestler in the edit suite. It can only be done if Misawa himself is facing Kobashi, and only under certain, very exact conditions. That's the level we're on with this one. It feels like the people behind this adored wrestling so much and wanted to get everything in that they could. And the end result is actually freaking awesome. Kind of unknown these days, but absolutely one you should play. We don't necessarily end with the best game in the video, but it's kind of right that we end with Wrestle Kingdom by Yuke's. This came out in 2006, and outside of a PS2 only sequel, it was basically the last Puro game we would see for a very long time. No surprise there, as Puro was starting to hit some pretty lean years, unfortunately. It's appropriate then that just about everyone comes to the Wrestle Kingdom party. The big three promotions, New Japan, All Japan and Noah, are all here, as well as big freelancers and legends. It's a pretty interesting roster. It should be noted that the PS2 version of Wrestle Kingdom is the only non-WWE game where you can play as a certain beast incarnate Brock Lesnar, immortalising his disastrous IWGP Championship run for all eternity. Being that this is a Ukes game, you may well be familiar with how this plays already, especially if you've played any of the GameCube Day of Reckoning games. As such, this is a bit looser when it comes to flowing like a wrestling match. The action tends to be speedier here than it is in other games we've seen, and you're able to get to a finisher pretty quickly. Still, you do generally have to start with weak moves, and there's a bit of momentum too. This isn't quite SmackDown where you can throw the big bombs right from the off. On the whole, it's okay. It certainly looks a bit drab when you compare it to something like ASPW3, but it's perfectly serviceable in the looks department. The general quality and care of things may be a little disappointing. For some it may feel like some awkward middle game that isn't totally an imitation of Puro, but it isn't much like a WWE game either. But there's lots of potential here. Wrestle Kingdom has the building blocks for what, like ASPW3, could have ended up being a bloody good game. But alas, it's a shame that thanks to the general state of Puro at the time, it never got much of a chance to evolve into such a game. And but I hope you've enjoyed this vid on some classics from the world of Puroresu games. There's a load more out there, so perhaps there could be a sequel someday. We shall see. Bye for now. A few months ago we had a look at a whole load of Japanese wrestling games that aren't Fire Pro. A lot of you seem to like it, so guess what? We're going to do it again. Because, well, there's a lot of games that I didn't mention. Plenty more obscurities, a fair few total dogs, but also some more thoroughly hidden gems that people don't seem to talk about at all. So this time around I'm going to try and be a bit more exhaustive. We have a few more than 10 to talk about this time around, as it's more of a journey of discovery. There's shameless Fire Pro rip-offs, there's alternatives to Fire Pro from the same folks who made the classic series, there's even a couple of SmackDown style games you probably don't know, and there are of course some quite weird ones. So, let's begin. Our first little trio are connected simply by having a wrestler's name on the front. First time out we had Genichiro Tenyu's game, which was a total disaster. But it's not the only one. Indeed, I've picked out 3 others like this for this video, all on the Super Famicom. We're starting off miserable with the first one, but we'll end with one of the best 16-bit wrestling games you can get. In fact, our first title isn't even really a wrestling game, but it's certainly worthy of mention. It's FMW Onita Atsushi. Oh dear. If you're familiar with FMW, you'll certainly have an affection for the almighty Atsushi Onita and his crazy hardcore battles, usually involving barbed wire and huge explosions. They certainly didn't take any half measures back in those days, that's for sure. And so, thanks to Japanese Kosoge favourites Pony Canyon, we have a game featuring himself and other FMW stars such as Megumi Kudo and Riki Fuji that's not actually a wrestling game, but is instead a fighting game. And it's absolutely dreadful. This is the sort of game where I don't really have to say too much. You can see for yourself just how miserable this game is. The jerky movement and shoddy frame rate honestly give this one the feel of a poorly made Chinese bootleg. It's as close as you can get on the SNES to something like, I don't know, VR Fighter vs Taken 2. The moves are so limited, and the only real amusing thing to mention is that you have explosive areas on each side of the screen that you can chuck an opponent in for loads of damage. So hey, this game did that years before Dead or Alive even existed. But yeah, this game is atrocious. The second worst in the whole video, in fact. We'll be covering the worst one at the end. Fortunately, things do get better quickly with Saikyo Takada Nobuhiko from 1995. This game takes us away from FMW's hardcore world and into the land of shoot-style pro wrestling, featuring UWFI's top star Nobuhiko Takada and a bunch of other wrestlers who've had their names changed, but you'll still probably recognise the likes of Gary Albright, Kazuo Yamazaki and Vader, who all make an appearance here. While it's a bit of a shame that you can only move from side to side, you do have a decently intricate bit of shoot-style simulation, with a lot of emphasis on actually getting into proper position for strikes or suplexes, and UWFI's points down system. It feels a bit like a decent boxing game, only the emulation of shoot-style puts this closer to being an early MMA title. The wrestlers are pretty well emulated too, and the game's a healthy challenge. It's quite hard to avoid being suplexed to hell and back by Gary Albright, and you certainly feel like you've taken a bit of a beating when it does happen. Not many people talk about this one, but it's definitely worth a look. Our third game here is an absolute classic. We go further still into MMA land for a game based on Pancrase. Here's Funaki Masakatsu Hybrid Wrestler. Much like the last game, you can play as the early shoot fighting star against a cast of characters who may well be a bit similar to other fighters you may know, although this one's a bit more outlandish. This game is by Technos Japan, and it's a seriously quality attempt at pro wrestling from these guys. There's lots you can do in this wrestling game, with different levels of strikes and grapples, dodging submissions, brawling outside of the ring, springboard moves off the ropes. There's way more here than your average 16-bit game, dwarfing even contemporary Fire Pro titles for variety. And playing it is seriously so much fun. Definitely one of the most exciting and well-balanced wrestling games on the SNES, this one. It doesn't even have to rip off Fire Pro to get there either. This licensed grappler is highly recommended by me. Much like the Fire Pro SNES titles, it is irritating that folks in the West were stuck with the acclaimed WWF titles and WCW Super Brawl, while games like this were kicking around in Japan. Still, while Masakatsu Funaki Hybrid Wrestler is an excellent Japanese wrestling game that doesn't simply take hefty inspiration from Human's masterworks, there's plenty of games that do. And hey, just because a game rips off Fire Pro doesn't mean it's bad. In the first video we had games like Gekito Burnin Pro Wrestling, Jikyo Power Pro Wrestling and JWP Puroresu Queens that were very much homages to Fire Pro, but they were still very good indeed. Today, however, I think we've got the best Fire Pro game that's not officially a Fire Pro title. A game that is in fact so good that it could actually be a match for all but the very best Fire Pro games. And shockingly, barely anyone talks about it at all. We're jumping over to the PlayStation for a look at Taito's utterly awesome Champion Wrestler. Much like Fire Pro, the roster's a mix of the best and most famous names from all the top Puro companies, slightly modified to avoid any kind of copyright issue, but you'll still easily recognise the likes of Jushin Thunder Liger, Masahiro Chono, Misaharu Misawa, Inoki, Vader, Hayabusa. Plenty of major names complete with some lovely illustrations in case you're not sure. The action itself is best described as a slightly more simple Fire Pro, but if you've ever played FP then you'll be immediately familiar with the concept of starting with low strikes and grapples and building up to more powerful ones, as well as the timing based grapple system. But the presentation here has taken a huge leap forward. As you can see, Champion Wrestler eschews the typical isometric Fire Pro view in favour of a more traditional wrestling hard camera, and as a 2D game it looks magnificent. Not only is the move animation just as well crafted as in Humans games, but there's so much wonderful detail. The roving cameraman, the crowd and announcers that actually react dynamically to what's going on in the ring, the welcome addition of some commentary, and tons of moves that fit each wrestler perfectly. Sabu will even magically pull a steel chair out of his crotch and perform an atomic Arabian facebuster. I mean, jeez, this is good. Graphics-wise, it's better than even the most recent Fire Pro game, perhaps. Literally, my only complaint is that there's no option for sim-in matches. I would love to sit back and just watch the game go at it, but playing it is a hell of a lot of fun. This is seriously up there. It may not be all the way original, but it is by far the best non-FirePro game that I've ever seen. Ridiculously, there's only a couple of little gameplay videos for it up on YouTube and not much more. Bloody hell. If you like ProRes and if you like FirePro, you need to play this game right now. It seems appropriate, after seeing such a blatant yet brilliant FirePro inspired game like Champion Wrestler, to switch over to the almighty folks themselves over at Human Entertainment. We didn't cover their own alternatives to their flagship FirePro series last time out, after all, for there's actually a few that ended up blossoming into a pretty excellent 3D wrestling series. So let's have a quick run through of Human, and later Spike's, FP alternatives. Now, I suppose you could start here with Thunder Pro Wrestling on the Mega Drive, which doesn't have the regular FirePro name, and was at one point going to be released in the West with Jesse Ventura on it. However, well, it is basically just a conversion of the original FirePro Wrestling PC Engine game. It's not too different aside from having a different name, and also being a hell of a lot worse. So we'll move swiftly forward to the arcade, and the first serious non-FirePro game, Blazing Tornado from 1994. Now, of course, this is a lot like a FirePro title in many ways. The viewing angle is the same, of course, although the sprites are naturally a lot bigger and more detailed to fit the arcade. The biggest change, however, is moving away from the usual timing system and towards classic arcade button mashing instead. And naturally, this does not work at all. Honestly, Blazing Tornado looks okay, but it's kind of a stinker. FirePro's grapples just don't really lend themselves well to button mashing, and the game feels grossly unfair as a result, more so than usual for an arcade game. It's just bloody irritating, honestly. I do get why you'd have button mashing in the arcade rather than timing, but this goes so far the other way that it feels like nothing but dumb Eddie Gordo style button mashing will get you anywhere at all with it. Not particularly good, this, and it didn't exactly set arcades alight. Or ablaze, come to think of it. So let's go to the PS1 for a game that technically is part of the FirePro series, but is so different to all the others that it's basically an alternative. Iron Slam 96. This is, you guessed it, the only official FirePro game to be made in full 3D. Aside from that, the controls and view are basically the same as ever, but does a full-on FirePro game work in 3D? Again, the answer is no, not really. The 3D makes everything a lot slower, and one of FirePro's greatest advantages is warp speed. This doesn't have that. It also makes for a lot of awkward movement, especially from the AI that gets stuck constantly on the ropes or on other wrestlers. This is unfortunate because it makes the game look quite shoddy. It's a shame that there's only a handful of wrestlers to pick from too. When wrestlers come together it all plays fine enough, but there's a bit too much awkwardness here and ultimately it's a miss. FirePro's first and last experiment with 3D, the series would go straight back to 2D with FirePro G, the next instalment on PS1. If the makers of FirePro wanted to do a 3D wrestling game, they'd have to think of something altogether different. And, of course, they did. Now, you may expect me to jump straight to the PS2 and Spike for a look at King of Colosseum, but before that, we've actually got another game entirely that came out in 1999 for the PS1 while Human Entertainment was still around. It's one you may not have heard of, Zen Nihon ProRes Oya no Tamashi. This is actually the first good human spike 3D wrestling game, and it's the almost forgotten bridge between just trying to emulate Fire Pro in 3D and make him king of Colosseum. First off, we've got official wrestlers, of course. This is an All Japan Pro Wrestling game, meaning that this does give Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 on N64 a bit of competition. And then you've got the game's system. It's a bit like Fire Pro with timing-based grapples and such, but different. There's a lot more positions for grapples like headlock or between the legs and so on. And there's also the Powerball system. You use these either for desperate reversals or big grapples like finishing moves. You've got a limited amount of them and they don't regenerate. The whole point is to, again, simulate the flow and feel of a proper match on the telly, just like Fire Pro. And this game does a fine job indeed, far better than the last two games. And also, for the PS1, we've got some very nice looking wrestler models and a smooth 60 FPS frame rate. This is a total smash. And naturally, it's just a quick leap from here to Spike's King of Colosseum games on PS2, which are, of course, excellent. I have mentioned them in passing a couple of times, although it is fun to note now that the system in place here isn't too much different from the one implemented in the All Japan game, just that this obviously looks better, has more moves and way more wrestlers. We go beyond just one promotion for a game that officially represents multiple major promotions. Indeed, the first game actually had two versions, King of Colosseum Red for 01 and Green for Noah. You could then actually merge the two together for a full game with every wrestler available. Although really these days you're better off just playing the second game, which doesn't do any of the multiple version nonsense and instead has one package with basically all the wrestlers you need. Great to look at, fun to play, it's one of the last proper 3D Japanese wrestling games and it remains a classic. Tenuous link time again, and I suppose a game with Colosseum in the title is as good an excuse as any to talk about one of the more popular 16-bit wrestling game series that we didn't mention last time, and another one that's very close to MMA, the three Sogo Katokugi Astral Bout games on Super Famicom. These are of course licensed titles for the bad boy himself, Akira Maeda, and his promotion Rins, and we have an interesting evolution here from a first title that's pretty messy and average, to a really in-depth and serious simulation of MMA that could well be considered something of a pioneer in the niche genre. The first one is a bit outlandish. You can play as Maeda and actually fight in the ruins of the Colosseum against some, well, basically monsters, in a sort of MMA shoot fighting style, weirdly enough. The potential is here. The game's not awful, but it is more than a little bit manky and honestly it doesn't feel too much like a SNES title, it kind of feels more like PC Engine. That said, could this be considered the very first MMA game, seeing as how it came out in 1992? Well, that's very possible. We don't have pinfalls or anything like that, with fights being won by either submission or knockout. It's certainly up for consideration as being the first ever, although it is far from the best. Astral Bout 2 and 3 are definitely where it's at here. For the sequels, the whole silly fantasy element was dropped. Now we have a game based on Akira Maeda's real-life Rins promotion, complete with fellow fighters from the company. The second game's an improvement in every possible way, much more of a serious simulation of Rins-style early MMA action, and a good variation in fighters. You may have to watch out for explosive kicks and the like when you're facing Maeda, but Volkan will try and tear your limbs off with 1,000 different submission holds. Not literally, mind you. This is much more slower and measured, a game where you have to tread carefully, Too many strikes can end you pretty quickly, and the last thing you want is to get stuck in the middle of the ring in a submission. Astral Bout 3 is kinda more of the same, only much bigger and better, and both of them together? Yeah, they make for a pretty good early whack at mixed martial arts. Hell, better than the early 3D UFC games for sure. They are quite challenging and tough to get into. I'm personally utterly terrible at them, as you can see, but there's quite a bit of complexity going on under the hood, and it's pretty fair to say that in the early mid-90s, Astral Bout 2 and 3 were quite ahead of their time. You may well want to seek them out. Okay, let's move on to something that's going to be familiar to every wrestling fan, especially those who grew up on PS1. Good old SmackDown. It was such a relief to finally see SmackDown on PlayStation in 1999. Before then, we PSX owners really didn't have much good in the way of wrestling games over here. Power Move Pro Wrestling, WCW vs. the World, that was it. In the West, N64 was undoubtedly the king of wrestling, and sure it would still be even after SmackDown, but at least it gave us something actually pretty good to play, and we could forget about those bloody Acclaim games like Attitude and Warzone. But here's something strange indeed. In Japan, you could play two alternative SmackDown games. They were both released in the long running Simple 1500 series, meaning that, yep, they're budget titles. As if you didn't know already how superior Japanese wrestling games are to Western ones, one of the top Western wrestling games on PS1 is given mere budget title status in Japan. But these games aren't bad, and they come with some quite shocking surprises. The first game, simply called The Pro Wrestling, isn't too much to shout about. It is a straight up version of the first SmackDown. You don't get slightly modified takes on well-known wrestlers, mind you. The game's roster is, very weird. It's kind of like what happens when you go into the edit mode and just try to create as odd a wrestler as you can. Most of them are either stick figure thin or utterly massive, and the costumes are outlandish as hell. Does it play any different to SmackDown? Nah, not really, and there's only single and tag modes here. It's not bad at all, mind you, considering that it is only a budget title. However, the second game, The Pro Wrestling 2, this is the one I want to talk about. Again, this is a straight alternative to SmackDown 2 Know Your Role, and it plays exactly the same. We don't have a weird roster this time, instead we do have takes on popular pro wrestlers who you may actually know. You've got the usual modes, and you've even got a Champions Road this time for something more extended. But this game has something special that was never in any SmackDown game. It's got a deathmatch mode. Hell yeah. You can change everything with deathmatch mode. You can fight in a soft tatami ring, or an ultra hard concrete ring. You can have inferno matches, something that didn't appear in regular SmackDown for 10 years. You can even take out the regular ring ropes and replace them with exploding barbed wire. Oh yeah. You can run your opponent into the ropes after beating them up a bit and watch the fireworks go off. This was never, and still has never been, in any SmackDown or WWE 2K game or whatever, and kinda makes this little budget game here a little bit more interesting than just a strange Japanese take on Yuke's popular series. Hell, death matches aren't something you get all that often in any wrestling game at all, so if you like a bit of bloody hardcore action, you may want to have a look at this one, if you can find it. In the first video, I did have a little look at Toukon Retsuden, the official New Japan Yuke's games on PS1 that were mostly Japan only aside from Power Move Pro Wrestling, and did predate SmackDown by a couple of years. So in the spirit of that, here's something more extended. A look at official games by New Japan and All Japan on the 16 bits, specifically on the Super Nintendo. In this pretty hot period for both companies, who had the better games? Well, the answer to this will become clear almost immediately. One set of games are good, and the other are complete trash. There's also a game that Westerners may be familiar with, if they played just about every Western-related wrestling game they could on the SNES. So, who's got the trash games? The answer to that is... yep, it's New Japan. New Japan had 3 official games on SNES, all based on the corresponding year's Tokyo Dome Wrestling World card. All of them are by a not particularly well-known company called Vari, and they are all completely terrible. However, the first is definitely the worst. 1993's Shin Nippon Pro Wrestling Chusenshi in Tokyo Dome appears to be a complete joke, quite frankly. I mean, look at how this bloody thing moves! I can't think of too many titles that are less jerky on the system. Playing it is just damn near impossible. The movement makes it bad enough, but the CPU is almost unforgiving. They just crowd you out and make it impossible to even move at all. The animation? That makes WCW Super Brawl look brilliant. This is an utter dog of a wrestling game. And yet, it is still not the worst one in the video. Again, that's coming right at the end. The second and third games, Battlefield in Tokyo Dome and Tokyo Dome Battle 7, well, they're a little better. The movement's been sorted out at least. But yeah, they still aren't any fun to play at all. Presentation-wise, these may be a little more appealing visually than the All Japan games, but that doesn't really matter, to be honest. Every second of playing these games was a chore and something I have no intention of ever repeating. Thank God that Ukes took over in the PlayStation era, that's all I can say. It's also worth mentioning that Vari made another bad wrestling game on the SNES, Stardust Suplex, which is a Joshi-focused title. No license this time, so you just play Jimmy Hart versions of popular wrestlers, but the game isn't any better than the official New Japan titles they made. Utterly rubbish, and the only thing to do is just move on from this cack. Oh, and there's also a version of one of these games for the PC Engine CD! You can now play the game, only there's some FMVs tacked onto it too! Is it still utter crap? Why, yes. Yes it is. Don't play any of these. What about the All Japan games then? Again, we have 3 titles, one simply called Zen Nihon Pro Wrestling, as well as Saikyo Tag and 234 Budokan, all made by Natsume. And you know what? They're actually pretty good. Once again, we have a series of games that's very much in the Fire Pro mould. We're back to the familiarity of tiered strikes and timing-based grappling when you come together. Lovely jubbly. The graphics have a bit more of a caricature feel to them, and they may not be as striking as the New Japan game's bigger models, but holy hell are they more fun to use. It's a simplified Fire Pro and easy enough to get to grips with, but that doesn't mean you can't have something that feels a lot like a wrestling match. There's also cool features like big team battles and even the ability to construct your own card. I'd definitely give these titles a solid rating. Indeed, one of these titles did come out in the West, sort of. The original All Japan game got a translation and was released for the SNES as Natsume Championship Wrestling. Not exactly a famous release, but it is still a way that you may have seen one of these games before now. The international release doesn't change much at all aside from the wrestlers and their names, so it's still perfectly fun. There's a couple of other loose ends to wrap up here too. A handheld version came out for the Game Boy, called Zen Nippon Pro Wrestling Jet. Now I'm not too sure if the game translates particularly well to the 2-button Game Boy if I'm honest, but it's not terrible. And there's also the much more strange Zen Nippon Pro Wrestling Fight the Pon. What we have here is a card game of sorts. Both of you pick moves from your hand and the strongest one wins. It's kind of strange and I can't really figure out how to play it at all, but the graphical style is quite entertaining. Right, we're going to finish things off with a whole bunch of games that didn't really fit into the other categories, climaxing with one of the worst and most hilarious attempts at a pro wrestling game I have ever seen. What we generally have here are titles that you may well struggle to get to grips with if you don't have an intimate knowledge of Japanese language. Not many of them are straight ahead wrestling titles, but it is cool to know that they exist. Now, seeing as we last talked about a card game, it's appropriate to start this section with a series I didn't mention in the last video, Wrestle Angels. There's a few of these games here. They got started on Japanese-only computers like the PC-98 and FM Towns. They're a bit anime and in some cases a bit porny, a bit H-game. Here we have one of the cleaner games, Super Wrestle Angels for the Famicom, Super Famicom that is. The game itself isn't too hard to grasp. Again, you both select a move from your hand, and the most powerful one, as designated by number, wins. Did you ever play the old WWF Superstars card game from the early 90s? I did, and it's a lot like that. There's some drawn moves and all that to accompany the action so that it's not just cards, and yeah, that's about it really. It's a casual sort of affair. Staying in the land of Joshi Puroresu, how about something that's kind of like a pro wrestling RPG? Such a thing actually does exist, sort of. Shioi Rinhei, Twinkle Little Star on the Super Famicom, is also an official licensed game featuring stars from the Ladies Legend pro wrestling promotion like Shinobu Kandori and Noriyota Teino. This is obviously a weird premise and there's a hell of a lot of text and options to choose from. I can't exactly make head nor tail of it, so I can't really tell you a lot about it beyond its existence, but you may be curious. It seems as though someone did start an English translation of the game, but it doesn't appear to have been finished. Moving over to the PS1, here's something I was able to get a bit more of a grip on. A series of games called Pro Wrestling Sengokuden, licensed by a popular Japanese wrestling magazine. There's 3 of these titles and they are certainly quite niche. These are management style games. You can take control of a wrestler or a promotion, and whichever you choose involves a lot of day-to-day running of things. You choose how your wrestler trains, who they hang out with, or who you want to sign, and ultimately you can put a card together. You don't control any matches, but there is crude yet functional 3D for watching the matches play out. This gets a little better over time. I would almost recommend these actually, if you're into things like this. There's quite a lot of menu action, but it didn't take me too long to start figuring out what each button does. Pro Wrestling Sengokuden 2 is definitely the better one. A highly specific game indeed, but there really isn't too much else like it from back in these days. Certainly not on console that I can think of. Our second to last game is a bit more straightforward. It's just a 3D Joshi Puroresu game that didn't fit into any of the other categories, but it does lead nicely into our final game. Zen Nippon Joshi Puroresu Jodensetsu Yume no Taikosen came out for the PS1 in 1998, and it's an official game for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. So naturally this means that the roster is fantastic. Manami Toyota, Kyoko Inoue, Yumiko Hotta, Aja freaking Kon. They're all here and they're all awesome. And the game? Yeah, it's not too bad as far as 3D wrestling on PS1 goes. It plays quite a lot like Yuke's Toukon Retsuden games, to the point where I did wonder if Yuke's made this as an offshoot of sorts, but that does not appear to be the case. Like a lot of these games, I didn't know of its existence at all until I started doing research for this vid, and like a lot of these games, I'm quite happy to have learned of its existence. It's a pretty good 3D Japanese wrestling game on PS1, meaning that basically it's better than just about every other PS1 wrestling game with the exception of SmackDown. And yeah, I know people are going to say, but WCW versus the world! And it's like, well, why the bloody hell did you play that on PS1? Everyone played it on N64. Doesn't really count. Anyway, with that digression over, we now come to the last game. And, hoo boy. It is, as I always say, a doozy. A wrestling game like no other. And for bloody good reason too. This final title, as you may have already guessed, is a Joshi Pro-Res title. Indeed, it's another official game for All Japan Women. And it takes us to a platform that I have not looked at before. The PCFX. Oh yes. People always wonder why NEC didn't make a 32-bit console after the excellent PC Engine. And the answer to that is, they did. Unfortunately for them, it was the PCFX, a hideous pile of shit filled with awful FMV games and no ability whatsoever to make 3D polygon-based games. Not only did NEC back the one horse, they backed a horse that was already blind and had one of its legs missing. The console was a total disaster, and it wiped NEC off the console map forever. And the wrestling game on show here, Zen Nippon Joshi Pro Wrestling Queen of Queens from 1995, is as good a showcase as any other game for the reasons why the PCFX was a complete failure. It is one of the stupidest ideas for a wrestling game I've ever come across. Of course, you at least have a good roster. Most of the folks from the last game, only Akira Hokuto and Toshio Yamada are here as well. But of course, this isn't 3D. This is FMV. So what do HuniX and NEC do? Well, they put all the wrestlers in front of a green screen and have them do half moves with each other, while also trying to pose menacingly, and they make a gameplay engine that's, this. Two wrestlers side by side, facing you and vaguely swaying about in a "I'm fighting" type of way. Push the buttons, and if you're really lucky, if you've been very good that day, you may do a strike or the wrestlers might come together. Most of the time nothing will happen though, and honestly, I couldn't figure out anything here at all. I can't think of any other wrestling game like this. I mean, I suppose it's kind of like the old microcomputer game Microleague Wrestling, I guess, only much worse. Still, what's really funny here is just how either bad these folks are at conveying the intensity of wrestling in front of a green screen, which is hardly all that surprising I suppose, or rather, how much they probably found this whole thing utterly daft. The most amusing part is capturing the moments when the wrestlers are quite clearly just laughing. They did go to the lengths of having every possible combination of wrestlers do all their moves against each other, but the result of that is seeing the huge Cheshire Cat grin that Yumiko Hotta has on her face when Manami Toyota picks her up for the finishing Japanese Ocean Cyclone suplex. That's funny, and at least these moments break up the game's general feeling of complete and utter lifelessness. This is just a completely stupid and ridiculous idea for a wrestling game that does at least fit the utterly daft console it emanated from. A total failure in all aspects, and one of the worst wrestling games I have ever seen. And I've seen a lot. But hey, it's a nice way to finish the video. I've had the idea for this vid for a while, although it does frequently get suggested. Sumo games are an interesting genre after all, especially to us folk because 99% of sumo games are stuff that we've naturally never seen here in the West. It's doubly interesting to me because rather than this just being a subject of simple curiosity, I love sumo. Always have, ever since it used to be on Eurosport back in the 90s. I'm familiar with some of these games already as it happens, and we've got some real good ones here. From what little I've seen online, there's a preconception that sumo games are pretty simplistic button mashers, and generally not that good. However, I'm here to say that actually, the best sumo games are a lot more complex than they might be given credit for, and provide a unique take on one-on-one fighting. So, with that in mind, here's a potted history of sumo games. We've got 10 of them. There's a few more than that, but these are the ones that I think best represent the sport's journey. And so, without any further ado, it's time to let out a hearty Hakkioi and get on with the slapping action. We begin with two arcade games, either one of which could basically be the first proper sumo game out there. Technosa's Susei Oozomou and Data East's Oozomou the Grand Sumo, both released in 1984. They're both a bit different from each other, although they set out what we're largely going to see. Your credit gives you entry into a heavily cut down basho, which is the name for a sumo tournament. You have 3 matches instead of the usual 15, and you must win 2 of them to proceed to the next level. In both games you have the option to slap and grapple when you come together, and as with Japanese wrestling games, there's more to things than simple mashing. There is mashing, but in particular with Susei Oozomou, you have to time an actual attack when the bar gets as close to the top as possible. That's kind of the key to victory. Technosa's game is the one that looks a bit more like an arcade game. It's certainly a lot more exaggerated in presentation than Data East's title, which is considerably more grounded in reality. They're both pretty cool games. You're going to get at least 3 matches with each credit, which I think is pretty fair as far as arcade games go. Data East's game is a bit more simpler perhaps. In the main, button mashing is kind of the order of the day for both of these. For being the first sumo games, both are quite cool, although neither are as influential on this little subgenre than the game that we're going to see next. I'd still recommend having a quick look at them, mind you. We skip ahead a couple of years for the first major sumo game to hit consoles, and believe it or not, it's a total classic. It's basically the game that's going to inform just about every other game that we'll see, one of the kings of this genre, and you might have never even heard of it before today. Now you may well already know Tecmo from some pretty cool sports sims over the years, Tecmo Bowl, Toukon World Cup, Tecmo World Wrestling and so on. And well, here's another one by them. Super Oozomou, released in 1987, was, at the time, the definitive word in sumo games, and as such, it's a fantastic proper introduction into the world of actually playing these things. It's pretty simple options-wise. You either start a new career, continue one via a password, or battle with a friend. To start a career, you just input a name and away you go. Your journey begins in the lower Makuuchi ranks, and you have to work your way up, through the Megashira numbers, to Komusubi, Sekiwake, Ozeki, and finally to the top rank of Yokozuna. You compete in a series of 15 match bashos, and your goal in each is to achieve Kachikoshi, a winning record of 8-7 or higher. Do so and you'll increase in rank. If you get a Make Koshi, a losing record, however, you may well drop in rank. As you win matches, your Rikishi gradually levels up, and you can also get bonuses if you beat wrestlers that are ranked higher than you. The best example of this is a Kinboshi, which you get if you're a Megashira and you defeat a Yokozuna. And if you do really well in a tournament, say 15-0 or 14-1, who knows, you may win it. This game may look quite intimidating, considering it's mostly in kanji, which very few people understand, and Lord knows I don't, I mean, I barely speak English. But really, it's simple enough to play. The controls are straightforward. After the ceremonial proceedings and the salt throwing ends, and the Goji, the referee, in this instance played by Tecmo's rabbit mascot, brings you together, you have a fair few options. Broadly speaking, B is used for slaps, or oshidashi, as well as initial grabs or even special throws. Another good stock technique is forward and A, which grabs opponents by the belt and tries to push them out. This is known as yoikiri. There are plenty of other moves, lifting opponents up by the belt, slapping them down, turning them around when you're on the edge. You get to grips with these quickly as generally they correspond to natural directions and buttons. The more moves you successfully execute, the more you sap the opponent's energy and the more momentum you obtain. When the bar flashes, it's possible to execute a special Kimarite, or finishing move. In this example, I have chucked my fellow Rikishi many feet into the air, sending him down with a massive crash onto the doyo, and most probably killing him outright. Ah, well, never mind. For this I will no doubt obtain a large reward of Kenshokin from the Goji at the bout's end. Bouts are usually pretty quick, although they can be filled with drama. Sometimes you get an easy opponent who you just quickly put away with forward and day or whatever. Sometimes you have a match that you just simply can't win yet because you're not skilled enough. Naturally, it's the matches against those closer to you in skill that end up being ding-dong, knockdown, drag-out fights that could go either way, and that's where the game really gets fun. It's not super complex, but it's simple enough to be very addictive. I ended up losing out in my first basho, but my Rikishi returned much stronger the next time out and was able to get a winning record comfortably. It's the sort of game that can happily occupy me for a decent chunk of time, and it's definitely one of the most important sumo titles out there, to the point where it's had several re-releases on everything from the PC Engine to the Virtual Console, as well as a sequel that we'll be seeing a little later on. If you want to get into sumo games, this perhaps is where you should start. There are a fair few other Famicom sumo games, most of which follow the template set by Sapporo Oozomou, but I'm just going to highlight one out of this lot, Chiyonafuji no Oicho, released by Face in 1990. The main reason why I highlight this one is because not many of these sumo titles are licensed games, mostly they're more generic than that. This is an exception, however, being that it highlights a specific Rikishi, no less a figure than the almighty Chiyonafuji, who dominated the sport throughout basically the whole of the 1980s. If any Yokozuna's worthy of a game named after him, yeah, this guy fits the bill. And the game itself is actually pretty okay. A bit simpler perhaps than Sapporo Oozomou, and the fights tend to resolve themselves a hell of a lot quicker. The fun exaggerated animations are still around, what with people crashing headfirst through the dojo and so on. And you can also happily watch the CPU wrestlers do their thing whenever you want, either in real time or fast forward. Or if you don't want to bother with that, you can just skip to your own fights. The main thing about this game, the main innovation, is that it brings a special meter to the table that you fill using the down button, and that you then use to perform moves. You have to constantly refill it. This is an innovation that we're going to see a lot of later on. It's not a bad game at all, although my personal preference is to Tecmo's game, as you can probably guess. Now, let's move on to the 16-bits. One curious thing is that, for the most part, sumo games seem to be Nintendo only, at least until PlayStation. For whatever reason, although more than likely due to the Big N's general dominance, there were very few on other platforms. The PC Engine only had one, and that was a sort of sequel to Sapporo Oozomou. The Mega Drive also only had one, and it's Harimanada, released by Sega themselves in 1993, and a fair bit different to the games we've seen so far. It's also another licensed game. This time, Harimanada is based off of a popular manga and anime. It's considerably more arcadey than other games we've seen, complete with a straight health bar as opposed to any attempt at momentum, and honestly, it's not very good. It certainly looks good, it's flashier than anything we've seen so far, and it's certainly better looks-wise than pretty much anything we're about to see on the SNES. It's a bit of a sluggish and unresponsive button basher in the play department, however, and the play is so shallow. The AI most of the time seems to fall if you just bash the slap button endlessly. Occasionally they may do something different like jump everywhere or counter a bit, but it's the sort of AI that then does only that instead of doing, you know, a mix of things. There's also a few special moves too, although I can't say I felt the need to ever use them. Oh, and this game follows the plot of the anime to the letter. Harimanada, a new Yokozuna, declares that he's going to beat the old record of 69 straight unbeaten fights, and that he'll retire if he loses even once. This does indeed mean that you have to win 69 straight matches in this game, usually against the same set of, I don't know, about a dozen or so Rikishi. Needless to say, the game gets terminally dull long before that point. The music's good, mind you. It actually sounds a hell of a lot like the music to Shinobi 3, meaning it's no surprise that Shinobi 3's sound team of Hirofumi Murasaki, Morihiko Akiyama and Masayuki Nagao also works on this game. On the whole though, for a sumo game and for a first-party Sega title, this is quite the disappointment. I feel that a lot of the misconception that sumo games are button mashers comes from this game, honestly. It's one of the more known sumo games out there, but it's bloody awful, especially compared to games we've already seen or are going to see. And indeed, on the SNES, Sumo goes from strength to strength. We've got two awesome titles to look at here. The first is Tecmo's proper follow-up to their original NES classic, Suppare Oozomou Rishin Shuseihen. This is a pretty good sequel, even if it generally follows the same formula as the original. If you've played that, then you should already be very familiar with how this game works. And if you haven't, it's very easy to pick up and play. These are probably the sumo games that I would recommend most people to start with. It's still got that nice cartoony feel about it, and it's very addictive. Mainly because bouts just come and go so quickly, you can easily get through a basho or two with no time at all, while having plenty of fun. Upgrading your Rikishi isn't just a matter of eating bowls of natto either. There's now stats to play with, as well as specific upgrades through mini-games between each basho. It's a jolly fun sequel, although it now has a different and much more serious contender on the other side of the doyo. If I was to single out one game as showing how generally in-depth sumo games can be, then I would pick this one, Takara's Oozomou Tamashi, or Oozomou's Spirit. It's a very different game from what we've seen before, one that's tougher to get into, a proper simulation of sumo that, once you get to grips with it, becomes really satisfying to play. While the aim of the game is naturally the same as most others, create your Rikishi from one of the few bases that are on offer and then take them up the ranks, the fighting is very different. You may well look at it and wonder how on earth it works at all. So, let me explain. At the start of a bout, you'll notice the middle meter there is going Garrity. You want to press Y when it's as close to full as possible, as this will give you an advantage at the start. This meter is the same as the one in Chiyoda Fuji on the NES. You use it to perform moves, and you charge it up using Y. Now don't hold it down too much, because it does reset to 0 once it's full, but just enough so you've got a full bar to play with. Now I take this bar basically to represent controlled breathing. The other buttons correspond to various grabs, shoulder buttons are used for slaps, and everything's about timing. The top and bottom meters are for endurance and resistance respectively. Resistance does go up slowly when fighters are together, but endurance is a limited resource that goes down when moves are performed on you and when you perform moves. The lower that both of these meters are, the more chance you have of losing the fight. Basically, there's stamina in play here, so you don't want to go crazy performing moves willy-nilly. Another thing to mention is the hands below the meter. These come into play when you're grappling, and they represent the grip that you have on your opponent's belt. You use the A button to try and get a grip, and it's quite important to do so. Certain throws, which you can perform with X, can only be done with a one- or two-handed grip. Quite clearly there's a lot to think about with this game. As I said, it's hard to get used to managing these meters. Even with all of this in mind, you will lose a lot when you start playing. You may even lose every match in your first basho, but that doesn't result in a game over or anything. You just dust yourself off and move on to the next tournament. Eventually, you'll start to get to grips with the game's timing, and you'll start winning. And winning in this game is very satisfying. Oozomou's Spirit, as you can see, has a much more realistic presentation than the other games that we've seen, which goes a long way to making it feel like the most earnest attempt at recreating the sport that we've seen so far. I would go as far as to call it the genre's equivalent to Fire Pro Wrestling. There's a moment, much like that game, where everything just seems to click and you just get it. If you're unfamiliar with this little genre, I wouldn't recommend that you go to this one first. Tecmo's games are much more friendlier, but this is definitely one to play because it's a brilliant little game. There is one more fantastic 2D sumo game to cover, mind you, one that very few people seem to know at all. I think I could find literally one video on YouTube for it, but it's awesome. It's on the PlayStation, and it's a part of the Simple 1500 series of budget titles. It's volume 58, and it's simply called Le Sumo. These Simple 1500 games can be variable in quality, but when they're good, they're well worth the price. and this sumo game turned out to be a highly addictive and very welcoming little bruiser. And once again, it's a game that destroys the misconception that sumo titles are just plain old button mashers. So, what do you do here? Well, you don't have to go into the full basho if you don't want to. You do have a more arcadey mode to play with, as well as a regular versus mode. The meters are a bit simple here, just momentum and resistance really. You can deliver some very satisfying slaps when the rikishis aren't together, and when they are, well, you'll notice the meter that goes up. You've got to press the button for your move when the meter's as close to the top as possible, sort of like Fire Pro again in that it's all about timing, do not mash. If you win that, the bar will flash on your side, at which point you perform your move with another button press, whether it be a throw, picking up by the belt, or just general pushing. Not as complex as Oozomou Spirit perhaps, but the excellent animation and the sound effects really do contribute to this one. There's other nice little touches, such as a painting of the finishing move once the bout's over, and like all the best sumo games, it's so fast paced. Before you know it, you've already played a whole bunch of bouts and you're looking to play even more. This is one of my favourite sumo games, and it's definitely one that you should seek out. Our final two games take the jump into 3D, as you might expect. We have one for the N64 first off that isn't quite as cool as most of what we've seen so far. It's 64 Oozomou 2. Now the look of this 3D title is certainly a bit different to what we've seen. Very Japanese, very chibi I suppose, and let's face it, it's definitely an acquired taste. There seems to be a big cast of characters as well, and lots of talking, lots of cutscenes. It gets a bit annoying, especially when you're used to so many of the good sumo titles being so much more immediate. Seriously, it makes you impatient. Just get to the damn fighting already. Anyway, once you're in the bout, it's weird. Pretty simple on the whole. Basically everything attack and defense is done with the C buttons. The game even pretty much tells you what to press most of the time. If the opponent's trying to throw you one way, guess what? Press the opposing C button. Then do the same on him, and more often than not, he goes over. You can also use the C buttons for your regulation big doses of maximum slapation. What's quite odd is how slowly the rikishis move. It's odd in that a lot of the game seems to run at a full 60 FPS, which is kinda rare on the N64, but the actual wrestlers themselves are as slow as molasses. It's a trifle disconcerting. It doesn't seem to be some issue with how the game's running or anything, it just seems to be the way it is. And needless to say, I don't like it. There's just too much going against this game in the end. Too many problems that put it far, far behind most other games that we've seen. Well, except for our Harimanada. It's a hell of a lot better than that one. Seriously, don't play that shit game.
両力士もうすでに体は真っ赤になっています。あーっと投げ技か。いどり。いどり。
And all too suddenly, we've come to our last game. It seems that much like Japanese wrestling games, sumo games had a pretty hard cut-off after the PS2 era. After then, it doesn't seem like anyone was really interested in spending the money to make any more of them. You get the odd casual game here and there that has a bit of sumo here and there, something like Sumotori Dreams for example, but that isn't really what we're covering in this video. And so, our final game, which is still one of the last proper sumo games to date, is Konami's Nihon Sumo Kyokai Kunin Nihon Oozomou Gekito Hon Bashohen from 2002. You can just call this Japan Sumo Association's Tournament 2 if you want. Most of the games we've seen so far have been unofficial affairs, although as you might expect a lot of the wrestlers in those games have been similar in name and appearance to real life sumos. Konami's game, on the other hand, is an official affair, featuring a lot of rikishis who are active in the early 2000s, and I do believe a few legends as well. Annoyingly, the character list is kind of bare in the beginning. You have to unlock a lot of wrestlers. which I presume you do through facing and beating them in bashos. Still, there's the likes of Musashi Maru, Asashoryu, Takanahana. Some names that you may well know are here, so long as you watch the sport. Once again, we've got a whole new system to learn. Naturally, we've got the pre-fight preparations to go through first, the salting of the ring, the announcements, the sponsor boards. It's all here. It's an excellent presentation to be sure, although you're probably going to be skipping through it after a few bouts. Once you get into a fight, you'll find that most everything is done with the analog sticks. The left one, as you might expect, moves the wrestler. The right is used for moves in conjunction with pressing the analog stick. Yes, that much unloved button, R3, finally gets a chance to shine in this game. If you're not together, R3 and a direction will perform slaps and charges, and when you're grappling, they'll attempt throws. The face buttons are used purely to counter attacks. You'll see the command come up, and you've got to be quick to make a movement that corresponds to it. And there's also L2 and R2. You use these buttons to get a grip onto your opponent's belt, and once you've got it, you hold these buttons down for dear life. A good grip naturally results in a stronger attempt at a throw. Stamina is very much in play with this game, as you should expect. Sumo is a sport about being very explosive and decisive. You cannot just perform moves willy-nilly. Seriously, if you try and perform 2 or 3 moves in quick succession, just hammering buttons, your Rikishi will be completely shagged out and he will be thrown to the ground immediately. You've got to know when to sit back and defend, and when to attack. It's a balance, as obviously you can't just sit back forever. Once again, it's going to take a good few fights to get used to this game's system. You're certainly going to lose a lot of bouts in the beginning. And again, once you do get used to it, winning is very satisfying. It definitely feels like you've earned that victory, and you've earned that big ol' envelope full of yen. Having said all that, while this game is good, and certainly as good as 3D Sumo has ever gotten, Sumo games just seem to feel more at home in 2D. They just work so much better there. Now it feels kind of odd to say that. Sumo is something that's gotten a little bit old-fashioned over time, as well as less commercially successful, which has surely contributed to the complete lack of sumo games over the past, nearly 20 years now. The genre didn't get much of a chance to evolve in 3D, is what I'm saying. But the 2D games are just so much more immediate and fast-paced, and in the end, that totally suits such a fast-paced sport. And with that, we're done. Now I really hope that this video, more than anything, has given you a bit of an education in the world of sumo games. It's a very niche genre indeed, but it's one that's produced a pretty decent hit rate. All but 2 of the games I've covered here are really good and totally worthy of your time, especially if you enjoy watching sumo, and heaven knows you should, or just if you're into fighting games, as sumo games are pretty bloody unique in their own way. Check some of these out for yourself and see what you think. Before you know it, you could be fighting for a place on top of the Banzuki, and that prize of a big old golden sea bream could be yours. Bye for now. Having already covered more than a fair bit of wrestling on this channel, this is another one of those videos that's kind of a no-brainer. Why not combine 2 things that I love? Wrestling and microcomputers, together at last. Now sure, the results may generally not be very good. It'll surprise very few people to know that we have a lot of utter garbage to go through in the 13 games I've picked out in this video, but it's not like it's a generic sort of crapness either. We've got some utterly strange affairs here. We're going to see famous cartoon characters fighting aliens. We've got ancient attempts at CD-ROM style multimedia games, some of the most broken games I've ever seen, and I would say at least a dozen guys that look sort of like Hulk Hogan. There's a lot of interesting stuff here, that's for sure. So let's not waste any more time. Let's get it on! Let's begin with one of the better games here, and one that a few people are likely to know. Rock and Wrestle, a 1985 computer game by Melbourne House. It came out on most platforms, although it's most famous on C64, and it's one of the first wrestling games of any note. Not the absolute first even on microcomputers, that honour goes to a frankly miserable port of Data East's Tag Team Wrestling, but probably the first that people generally enjoyed. You've got a few characters to fight against with your main dude, who to my eyes looks a bit like Ken Patera. He'll be facing a motley crew of various stereotypes that we're gonna see variations of in most games, to be honest, and your objective is to bash through all of them as much as your heart desires. Either that or just have a few matches with your mates. Naturally, there's some parts of this game that haven't held up too well. I will be honest and say that I've never quite managed to figure out how you actually play this game too good. All the button bashing in the world doesn't ever seem to help me actually win a grapple. Looking at videos of people who know what they're doing, I can see that the game is a bit broken if you just flat out play to win it. If you get your opponent on the mat, it's kind of easy to stomp his health straight down to 0 and pin him immediately. But if you play it to screw around and have a bit more fun, well, you'll probably have just that. The main thing about the game is that for 1985, the animation is really, really good. The exaggerated moves are a lot of fun, all the airplane spins and whatnot, and the low quality speech is very endearing. To be honest, there's more animation in this 1985 game than most of the other games we're going to see in this video. And again, this is one of the very first pro wrestling games. That should prepare you mentally for some of the lousy stuff we're going to see. This is quite a fun game to watch, not necessarily a great game to play, but it does certainly deserve a mention when it comes to the history of the wrestling video game genre. Championship Wrestling, a C64 game by Epix from 1986, is another game that belongs on the OK pile. This was at one point set to be a WWF licensed game, and if it had been, it would have been the first one ever, but it never materialised, and instead we get the mix of guys who look sorta like folks you may know, as well as good old Russian stereotypes, Native American stereotypes, Middle Eastern stereotypes, that sort of thing, you get the idea. You can either have a quick little practice match against the computer, or you can get as many as 8 people together for a tournament, which is quite a nice touch actually, if you happen to have 7 friends who fancied their chances in the squared circle. The graphics for this actually look quite nice for what is, again, a pretty early game. Hell, it looks like a C64 Fire Pro, what with the isometric ring and all that. There's even some cool details like the changing banners in the crowd and, again, some not all that bad move animation. It's generally a quick game. Health bars go down very fast once you get a few moves going, although they do regenerate fairly quickly, which I guess allows for a little bit of momentum. Again, it's not necessarily brilliant. When I say quickly, I do mean it, as winning matches are often simply a matter of getting a couple of strikes in, hitting a move and then pinning the opponent. It's only an okay game. But, like I said, in this world, being okay is enough to be one of the best games in the video, I'm afraid. We'll see later on. So what game had the honour of being the first ever World Wrestling Federation tie-in? That would be Microleague Wrestling from 1987, which also doubles up as one of the more unique wrestling titles ever released. This isn't your usual joystick waggling and button mashing action. Instead, it's a strategy game of sorts with a pretty high level of presentation for the time. We've got text commentary, we've got a crowd with proper noises, and we've got the actual wrestlers in the flesh. Well, in digitised picture form anyway. Microleague Wrestling tried its best to bring the proper spectacle of a big match home to your computer. The original disc featured 2 such events, with Hulk Hogan taking on Randy Savage on one side, and Hulk Hogan taking on Paul Orndorff on the other. If you don't like Hulk Hogan, well, screw you, buddy. Go watch some Russian wrestling or something, you lousy commie bastard. How does the game work then? Both wrestlers have a list of moves, basic moves, major moves, and a special move. You and the opponent pick a move, the hidden die are rolled, and one of you succeeds. Said move is then played out with the help of text commentary, digitised images and appropriate noises. The quality of such things naturally depends on the platform. It looks perfectly okay on the Amiga, for example, but this was also on Commodore 64, which I think it's fair to say is a noble effort, just to, be kind. Basic moves obviously have the most chance of landing. You're probably best off doing a few of those before attempting the major moves, and once you've dealt enough damage to your opponent you can try and perform the special move. This move is the only way to pin your opponent and win the match. You can also perform a block which, if successful, recovers a little bit of your energy. Later incarnations of the game also allowed faces to rally the crowd and recover more damage, and heels to cheat, which obviously does a lot of damage but risks disqualification. It's quite fun, for a bit anyway. It is very slow paced, it doesn't take too long to see all the things, and you may well get bored before a match actually finishes. However, I can imagine that back in 1987, this was freaking amazing. You can actually see the wrestlers as they were on the telly, as if they were in your own home. If you have nostalgia for this, then it's probably going to be pretty strong, and if you don't, you likely won't get it. There's certainly very few other wrestling games like this one, especially in the West. We may as well stick with the WWF for a game that I myself do have a lot of nostalgia for, believe me. Ocean's WWF Wrestlemania, which came out in 1991 and was sort of presented like a computer port of Technos' arcade games, meaning Superstars and WrestleFest. Now comparing this to WrestleFest would be like sticking Special Delivery Jones in the ring against Andre the Giant, but even if this game isn't good, it certainly holds a place in my heart. This is the first wrestling game that I ever owned. 1991 was the year I started watching wrestling, due to being lucky enough for the family to have Sky, and I could now play as my favourites. Well, 3 of them anyway. Still, those 3 were Hulk Hogan, the Ultimate Warrior, and the British Bulldog. And that's more than enough for any 6-year-old kid who's starting to fall in love with the WWF. So you pick your guy and then they battle against a selection of heels on their way to the belt. You've got to get through Mr. Perfect, the Warlord, the $1 Million Man, the Mountie, and finally Sergeant Slaughter. Before each match you even have a bit of a promo exchange and jawjack with your next opponent, where you get to choose an appropriate response to their insults. The controls are pretty simple. You get a punch and a kick, a strong drop kick, there's a running attack, a stomp on the ground, and so on. And of course, there's the grappling. When wrestlers come together, they lock up, and it's time to waggle that joystick furiously. You'll be doing this a lot in every match, so if you play this game a fair bit, you could well expect to break your quick shot or bug or bloody Terminator characteristic or whatever you've chosen to play the game with before too long. A modern controller with a nice D-pad does kind of trivialise the waggling. Win the grapple, and you perform your special move. Knock the opponent's health down to 0, pin him, and move on to the next bout. Yeah, it's pretty simple. It's kind of crap. But still, nostalgia prevents me from giving it any kind of bashing, at least when it comes to the Spectrum version. This was a part of my formative love of professional wrestling, so, to me it's a classic, even though it is rubbish. Alas, Ocean, by way of Arc Developments, followed WrestleMania up in 1992 with a game that was much worse: European Rampage. This game bumps up the playable characters from 3 to 4, and you now have to pick 2 of them, choose a team out of Hogan, Warrior, Randy Savage and Bret Hart, and then go against several teams in different venues. You have to fight the Nasty Boys, the Natural Disasters and Money Inc. 3 times before finally facing the Legion of Doom for the title. Now, this is all terrible here on Amiga, you can probably see that for yourself. but it's nothing compared to the Commodore 64 version. Here on the C64? Well, obviously the already poor graphics here are even worse. You can kinda tell that this game was made with no love or even basic knowledge of wrestling. Most of the time when you pin someone, they're actually lying on their front, which, if you know your wrestling, you'll know makes absolutely no sense. Unless you're Cameron. The two most effective attacks in the game are rolling into them on the ground like something out of a freaking Three Stooges short, or dodging one in attacks, as the CPU will do those constantly, hurting themselves every time. The animation is pathetic. There's a backbreaker which literally just reuses the standing kick animation. The most amusing part of the game, however, is that it's not a tag team game anymore on the C64. We're back to singles matches. Now, does this mean that your guy has to go against the WWE's top heels? The likes of Ric Flair, Sid Justice, Jake Roberts, The Undertaker, even Papa Bloody Shango? No. Arc Developments, in their infinite wisdom, just picked one wrestler from the tag teams that were in the MIGI version, and amazingly, they picked the worst choice every time. Basically, you have to fight Typhoon, Jerry Sags, and IRS 3 times before you face Animal for the championship. Animal. This is, without question, the most pathetic lineup of opponents in wrestling game history. I mean, it could have been Earthquake, Brian Knobbs, Ted DiBiase and Hawk, and that still isn't great, but this? Holy shit. This is a game filled with what the OSW review folk would call boys, and they're not even good boys at that. They're the shittiest possible boys, in fact. Jeez, the state of this tribe. One of the worst official WWF tie-in games ever, if not the worst full stop, to be honest. It's even worse than WWE 2K20. Okay, that's about all there is when it comes to official games for the WWF and so on. Now we tread into some murkier waters. The ones with no branding at all. The budget games and the like, where we find weirdness and crapness far beyond what we've seen already. Yes, even worse than European Rampage. We start with something relatively inoffensive. Wrestling Superstars by Codemasters for the ZX Spectrum. This came out very late, February 1993, which I do believe makes it the last title that Cody's released on the ZX Spectrum. Naturally, their hype machine is still in rude health. The cassette inlay promises real graphics, whatever that means. None of those fake graphics here, I suppose. Are they saying that you're actually going to be able to see what's going on in this game? Because, well, thank God for that. The cover also features Hulk Hogan, or at least someone that looks almost exactly like him, to the point where this obviously unlicensed cover art could have landed Cody's in legal hot water, if the WWF had ever been aware of this obscurity. Speaking of which, as this is the last Cody's title on Specky, this game is quite rare. It's not exactly DJ Puff in terms of value, but it will take you a fair bit of time to find if you decide to buy it for whatever reason, if you're going for like a complete Cody's collection or whatever. Is it worth spending that time on to find? Well, no. Although it's not overtly terrible. The music's nice at least. You play as the Darling Dude, the muscular Hogan-esque brother of Cody's head honchos Richard and David, I presume, and face off against equally alliterative but more heelish opponents on your way to some title or other. The move selection is, as you might expect, minimal. You can punch, you can run, and waggle your joystick to perform a big slam, and that's about it. Weirdly, there's no actual free counts in the game. You can pin your opponent, but it only saps their energy. However, when they're nearly down to 0, this is the most efficient way to get him there, which ends the round. Every bout is the best of 3 rounds, and yeah, there's not really much else to say. Basically, it's like a budget version of WWF Wrestlemania. Although, if you do get stuck with it, well, you could always call one of Codemaster's 0891 tip lines to get a surefire strategy to win the game. Calls only cost 36p per minute at off-peak times, 48p all other times, and make sure you get the permission of whoever pays the phone bill first so that we don't get sued. Ah, Codemasters. They could be such knackers. Actually, this being such a late game, I don't think they bothered to create an 0891 line for Wrestling Superstars, so you're probably shit out of luck. Oh well, this being such a mediocre game, it's not exactly the end of the world now, is it? So much for Codemasters' contribution to the world of old wrestling games. Let's have a look at the much stranger game offered up by another UK budget game label, that being Alternative. There's certainly some oddities to be found in this company's library, but perhaps none more so than Popeye 3 WrestleCrazy, another late release from 1992. To think that once upon a time everyone's favourite spinach-munching sailor man starred in a famous and memorable title by the almighty Don Priestley. Alas, those days have long passed. Mind you, if you know your Popeye, you might not think that the idea of him wrestling is all that odd. He's a strong man, he likes to get into fights, and he even did a bit of wrestling here and there in the comics. But he isn't wrestling Bluto for the sake of protecting olive oil here. He's wrestling in outer space, because, well, who the hell even knows? The plot says that Popeye has to save the world from something called the Crags, just sounds like a sexually transmitted disease, by representing Earth in an intergalactic wrestling contest. Which I guess is fair enough. But then you meet your first opponent and it's quite literally a xenomorph from the Alien movies. There's no mistaking it. Back in these final days of the 8-bit micro, seriously, in terms of copyright you could get away with murder. The action features more limited moves and a lot more joystick waggling. I mean seriously, most of these games will definitely give you a bit of a Popeye style arm workout if you play them enough, not to mention costing you a fortune in replacement sticks. Items also get thrown into the ring. Hamburgers replenish your health, spinach powers you up and enough of it allows you to perform Popeye's Turbo Typhoon special move, and bombs hurt you. It's, well, it's certainly different. About on the same level as Wrestling Superstars gameplay wise, although the graphics are better and it is a fair bit more memorable. I mean, where else can you control Popeye and punch out a xenomorph? This is truly a game that stands on its own. Although, I don't think many would want to stand near it, to be fair. You may well think that Popeye 3 WrestleCrazy looks quite naff, but it's frickin' WWF No Mercy compared to the next thematically similar game we're looking at. Sadly, we couldn't do this video about Microcomputer Wrestling games and not go to the C64 for a dreaded bout of Intergalactic Cage Match, which is, without question, the worst wrestling game ever made. Nothing comes close. You may know it already if you're familiar with Ashen's video on it, but if you don't, well, let's endure it. Not that there's much here, but what is here will boggle the mind. This game came out courtesy of another budget label, Mastertronic, and was unleashed onto the world in 1987. Once you've gotten over the hideous, and I really do mean hideous, title music, you have a range of characters to choose from. The Hulk Hogan ripoff is here as usual, but you can also play as Hagar the Horrible, the Fly from the David Cronenberg movie, a really big Smurf and various other visually displeasing characters. This is all you can really do in the game. Choose a character, choose an opponent, and then fight against either some other poor bastard who's playing this with you, or the computer. And the action, well, it's something else, again. When you play the game and actually choose to fight with the opponent, it's mainly a question of pressing buttons at random. There's no point in strategy. It being a cage match, the goal is to beat the opponent down enough so that he stays down long enough for you to climb out, which doesn't take long. I quickly want to point out the animation cycles and just how broken they are. I mean, holy hell, the Hulk Hogan copy literally explodes in one of the frames when he's getting up. But that is far from the most objectionable thing about this game. Nothing that I said about the gameplay actually matters at all, because you can literally hold left at the start of a bout, climb up the cage, and the opponent can do absolutely sweet Fanny Adam about it. You just go up to the top and you win. Amazing, eh? The game must have gone through literally nanoseconds of testing. Hilariously enough, it is possible to shake the cage, but only when no one is climbing it. We have truly reached a critical mass of shit. I think you'll likely agree with me that this is the worst wrestling game ever. This is the top trump card, the joker in the pack. You draw this, and you automatically win. What's even more surprising perhaps is who developed it. Frickin' Sculptured Software. Amazingly, they would make more wrestling games. A lot more. In fact, they would be the main producer of WWF games back in the early to mid 90s. Thankfully they got a lot better at it. Their games, the likes of WWF Raw and Royal Rumble are, well, just average really, but that's complete bliss compared to their first attempt. They even had another go at a steel cage centric game, WWF Steel Cage Challenge. Now this game was absolute bollocks, but it's still 1,000 times better than Intergalactic Cage Match. But I suppose that, having made all these other much better wrestling games, Sculptured Software did manage to right the massive wrong they created with Intergalactic Cage Match. Sort of anyway. Now in all honesty, there is no real way to top Intergalactic Cage Match. It's the crown jewel of gaming wrestle crap, both in terms of the expression and the shitty Saudi blood money show. But there's still some other games to show off at the video's end, 5 to be precise, and we'll run through them fairly quickly just to finish things off. Here's another lousy budget title that somehow managed to get a known wrestler on board, Sergeant Slaughter's Mat Wars for the C64. This is sort of different in a way in that you play as both a manager and a wrestler. You start by bidding on the wrestler you want in an auction, and then you're away. It all looks promising, but there's nothing to really do between bouts other than bet on your wrestler or try and fix up another match. And then when you get to actually wrestling, well, it's not good in the slightest. There doesn't seem to be much hit detection or just anything at all, really. A cool concept, but the execution is utterly disappointing. Things don't get too much better with Zeppelin Games' American Tag Team Wrestling, it has to be said. There's not a whole lot to say here, as a lot of the things that are bad about this game are things we've seen before in other lousy titles like European Rampage. It's a thoroughly simplistic game that again came out late in 1992, by which time a lot of companies didn't really care too much about what they were putting out for the micros. If I were to summarise it, I'd say it's an utterly inferior in every way take on Rock and Wrestle. And that game, by this time even, was 7 years old. So yeah, it's rubbish. If you're looking for tag team action, maybe you can find something in Body Slam on the C64 instead. Now this is actually a port from the arcade of Sega's game by Software Creations, meaning two things. One, that we do get an awesome soundtrack courtesy of Tim Follin, and two, that the game isn't very good. Still, this is a port of the game that was known as Dump Matsumoto in Japan, and consists of Dump's army going against the Quash Girls. An awesome bit of fun for fans of 80s Joshi Puro. They're all still in this port, albeit with sillier names that kinda make them sound like relatives of the Fat Slags from Vids. The game itself has very annoying controls. It feels impossible to actually move diagonally for some reason. But, it's not completely horrible. At least it doesn't involve too much joystick waggling. Lastly, there's two Amiga games to look at. The rather obscure Italian game Top Wrestling is the first one up, and it's actually not too bad. In that, there's hit detection and the wrestlers can move around properly. There's a whole bunch of wrestlers, mostly Jimmy Hart versions of folks like Brutus Beefcake, Ultimate Warrior, Sergeant Slaughter and, of course, Hulk Hogan. It's not all that varied, especially as everyone has basically the exact same moveset, but it's not too terrible when it comes to being a very basic arcadey wrestling game. And we end on a thoroughly low note. International Championship Wrestling, published by Hewson in 1990. This one spoils you utterly by giving you all of 3 wrestlers to choose from. The action is utterly incomprehensible, ugly as sin, and most of the time it doesn't feel like my wrestler can even bloody move. I never figured this game out beyond doing a punch. I did try, but the controls are utterly inscrutable. What's even weirder is that the game nicks both the old WWF Royal Rumble music and Delirious by Prince for its music, as in samples from the actual frickin' songs. Clearly no one bothered to check the game before release as well. This could have resulted in ruinous lawsuits. I mean, WWF's bad enough, but taking stuff from Prince? God help you. But no one noticed budget Amiga games back then, and their many copyright violations. Anywho, this would be the worst game featured in just about any video except for this one, thanks to the existence of Intergalactic Cage Match. Still, it continues the low standards set by most of the games we've featured here. I've done a few of these compilation vids now, and it's fair to say that of all of them, this video features the worst titles by far. There is very little that is redeemable here. But there's no way you can say that we haven't seen anything interesting. Not when there's Popeye pinning a Xenomorph's shoulders down on the mat for the 3-second tan. Bye for now.